My name is Lisa. I'm a fourth year geography and social policy student, and today I'm going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 and austerity on autistic people and people with a learning disability in Scotland. So, what is a learning disability? A learning disability is something significant and lifelong. It starts before adulthood and impacts an individual's development. A person with a learning disability might need support to understand information, to communicate, and to learn skills in order to lead a fulfilling life. So I have quite a personal link to this topic. So this is my twin brother, Louis. He's 5 minutes older than me. And when we were around the age of 2, starting to speak, starting to toddle, my mum and dad realised that Louis wasn't quite developing in the same way that I was. And latterly, around 2 or 3, it was 2003, they found out that he was autistic. So, autism, it's a spectrum condition, and it affects all autistic people differently and to varying extents. Although not all autistic people experience it in the same way, specific autism characteristics can include difficulty communicating, a need for routine and repetition in order to cope with the uncertainty of life and what daily life brings, struggle with change, and also we refer to autism in terms of low support needs and high support needs. And Louis has what we would term quite high support needs. He does need support in pretty much every part of his life, so 24/7 support. And although he can speak, he can't really converse. But despite all of this, up until the pandemic, Louis had an incredibly active life, participating in sport multiple times a week. He went boxing, he went to the gym, and through the amazing special needs school that he attended at home, not at home, in my hometown, he had a very large social sphere out with the family unit. However, the pandemic came along, unfortunately, and as we all did, Louis lost his pre-COVID-19 routine. And as was kind of instructed at the time, we all started to stay indoors. So Louis obviously was staying indoors and kind of adapted to a new comfort zone, which really he started, as we all were, waking up at lunchtime, going to bed very late at night, watching TV, not really much structure, and also was really only going out maybe once every few days and doing the exact same walk every time. And this was good during the pandemic because it meant he was safe from the virus. But obviously as we move into the living with COVID phase of the pandemic management, becomes more and more anxious about future change, and he struggles to communicate his feelings due to his autism characteristics, leading to Louis becoming more distressed and having more frequent maybe meltdowns, leading to him wanting to revert in his comfort zone for more certainty. Now, I wanted to understand when I started doing this research was if this was impacting just Louis or impacting everyone with autism, or sorry, all autistic people, and everyone with a learning disability. And this led me to conceptualize social long COVID. So social long COVID, it occurs when the long-term social and spatial impacts of the pandemic, so isolation, routine change, and lack of social interaction, continue to negatively impact an individual after pandemic control measures have ceased. So, however, when I started to dig and realized that more and more people's lives were being impacted by the pandemic with a learning disability, I found some statistics, and these are the mortality statistics of COVID-19 for people with a learning disability. So it was 4 times higher. People with a learning disability were 4 times, their mortality rate was 4 times higher than that of the general population, which is quite stark. However, due to the underrepresentation of people with a learning disability within government records, it was actually could be 6 times higher. When I started to dig a little bit more, I found that during the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic, so between March and June 2020, actually what was happening in some hospitals that were really struck for resources was that people with learning disabilities were having compulsory do not resuscitate orders without the consent of their families placed on them, meaning that if Louis and I were to enter a hospital like this at the peak of the pandemic with an illness, could be COVID, could be something else, and both of our organs started to fail, it would mean that the hospital would choose to save me over Louis simply because he had a learning disability and I didn't. But this links into much larger, ongoing exclusions and mistreatment of people with learning disabilities in the UK. The UN came out with a report in 2016 which explained that the UK government's austerity policy had actually violated the human rights of people with disabilities in the UK, because the austerity measures were taking away the support needed for these people to lead a fulfilling life. Moreover, before the pandemic, nearly half of all people with a learning disability were dying prematurely. This was for whatever reason, and this was because of their mistreatment within hospital settings and lower socioeconomic outcomes which are impacting their health. This all links into what an amazing disability academic called Frances Ryan. Her analysis of austerity has been seminal, and she argues is the demonisation of disabled people within the UK. And what's happening is, because this group is seen as economically inactive, they are not deemed worthy of the support that we are as able-bodied people. So my methods, what did I do for my research? I conducted quite an advanced literature search, articles, academic text and government reports in disability studies and human geography, which is my area of study. I also had self-constructed data, so interviews and questionnaires with family members, industry experts and support workers of people with learning disabilities in Scotland. I also conducted thematic analysis and thematic coding, so pulling out all the different themes that I could see in relevant documents, blogs, news articles and government reports. Now, what I found. So lots of themes came up in my research, but some key themes that really came up was that people's independence was being used against them. So this is put really well by an industry expert who I spoke to, who explained to me that it was the people who were managing their life just fine because they went to an art group on a Tuesday. They just lost all of that overnight, and it's not being put back because they can just manage and they are still alive. So what I'm really trying to get at here is that because in the pandemic people were able to go from just living to surviving, the fact that they could still survive, local authorities who were already strapped for money were cutting away their support because they could justify it, because they could say, well, they're still alive, so we don't need to do anything else. This led to people feeling abandoned and anxious, and I spoke to a support worker who explained that she supports a girl in Glasgow who's now not left the house in 2 years because she's that anxious about losing her routine, and she's that anxious that she's going to catch the virus or get told off because she's not obeying COVID rules. This as well has meant that some people that maybe had lower support needs and had their independence prior to the pandemic have had to move back into the family home, and they've maybe had to leave employment. This as well has not only impacted the individuals who have learning disabilities, but has also impacted their families. So much so that a mother that I spoke to, she said that she was grieving her own independence because she now understands that the government, local authority, they're not going to help her, so she needs to carry on supporting her daughter on her own. So, some take-home messages for today. My research argues that we need to try and break this cycle and give people with learning disabilities and their families more support in a post-pandemic world. We need to break this cycle of treating people differently because they don't conform to an able-bodied and able-minded norm. And just kind of a final take-home message would be that after the pandemic, some people who caught COVID-19 were left with long COVID. However, I believe that my research shows that all people with a learning disability have been left with social long COVID to some extent or another, and this continues to impact both them and their families every day. Thank you for listening.